Hello. A little bit about this week's work and some key things to keep in mind. So, the assignments for this week are to finish chapter 4 and do all of chapter 5. So, read that stuff and make your posts. Again, I recommend that you do this in pieces. In other words, that you read for an hour or a half hour and then make a post. So you get your 3 posts in, and then just make sure you look back before the end of the week and reply to 2 other students, and then you get full credit. Also, you get some extra credit points if you get at least 2 of your posts in, by Thursday. So, getting on that and getting it done in pieces is a way to make sure you get it done. You've got the next 2 art discussions. I will have my versions of the first 2 art discussions so that you can see based on what score you got, and also my versions, what I'm looking for, so you can do better as you go forward. There's a test on the 11th. That's a week from Monday. It is due by 11:30. It covers chapters 1 through 3. It's 50 multiple choice questions. You have an hour to do the test. Just make sure you devote an hour sometime in that time period. If you want to review, my recommendation is look at the terms at the end of the chapter. There are some bold-faced terms. Make sure you know what those are. Know like some of the main figures. Figures that get repeated, more than once, that have a big scene, know who they are, and I think you'll be in pretty good shape. There's also the first essay. Now, of the essays, I'm only going to count 3 of the 4 essays. So, if you need to let this go, that's fine, but that means you need to do the remaining 3. The essay there are 3 questions. You're going to pick one. You're going to write a paper of 2 full pages, which would be 600 or more words. So I'm looking at word count as far as that goes. So if you use gigantic font and fill 2 pages with 100 words, that's not going to be treated as a 2 full page paper. It's going to be treated as that you blew up the font. Okay, so just keep that in mind. You want to be clear. You want to develop your points. You want to make sure you have lots. And by lots, I mean like maybe a dozen or more citations from the text. These don't need to be whole lines. They can be words, they can be phrases, but you want to back up what you say. Pretty much everything that you say, you should be able to back up with something from the text. The material for this week. So, chapter 4:3 is the Middle Eastern, alternative comparison to Homeric Hymn number 2 to Demeter. This is called In the Desert by the Early Grass. It's much older than the Greek stuff. Greek literature starts around 750 BCE or so, and this is much older than that. It's difficult reading, but there are things in the margin that sort of summarize. They will help a lot. If you're just reading the poem without those marginal things, it's going to be very tough to know what's going on. But it involves a mother goddess figure named Dutur, who goes after her son who has died. His name is sometimes Dumuzi, sometimes Damu. So this is similar to Demeter wanting Persephone back, but in this case, Dutur actually sort of travels to the underworld, or at least near the underworld, to try to get her son back. The modern stuff, right, the Nachleben section for chapter 4 are 3 modern poems, contemporary poems on Persephone. Now, Persephone doesn't get much lines in Homeric Hymn number 2 to Demeter. Rita Dove has a poem called Narcissus Flower, which describes, in poetry terms, but basically describes her situation. She had been an art student and was raped by the person who was using her as a model. Now, I have been told that particular poem can cause sort of flashbacks if you have been the victim of sexual violence. So if you need to pass that poem up, just do it. I mean, just skip that poem. Diary Underworld by Rachel Zucker takes the following approach. In Zucker's version, Persephone wants to be with Hades. She's tired of being basically stuck with mom and basically wants a life of her own. So that's a different take. That's not the take in Homeric Hymn number 2, but it is a more modern take where women, girls and then becoming women actually do have some agency, do have some say in their situation. And then Persephone in America by Allison Townsend is interesting because she looks at Persephone in terms of American sort of figures and images that girls becoming women might have, like Barbie dolls. And apparently Townsend went to Woodstock, and so in her mind, so does Persephone. So the last two poems I think should be fine. If you have been a victim of sexual violence, you may want to avoid Narcissus Flower by Rita Dove. Moving on to chapter 5, we've got Aphrodite, Homeric Hymn number 5. To Aphrodite is the passage. This tells the story of Aphrodite and how she would zap other gods to fall in love with mortals, and she could do this for all the gods with 3 exceptions. 3 virgin goddesses who have no interest in sex. She couldn't affect them, but everyone else apparently could come under her spell, and Zeus gets upset with this. Zeus then makes Aphrodite fall in love with a mortal, because up to this point she has not been gone to bed with a mortal, and has gone around bragging that all the other gods are weak and they are susceptible, but she's been impervious to this. So he somehow gets her to fall in love with a Trojan prince who's actually acting as a shepherd. It's sort of strange, named Anchises. And it's sort of a comic poem. It has some funny things in it. The second section, the scholarship section, is a piece by a scholar named John Winkler. He is looking at a festival in Athens, an Athenian festival called the Adonia. This is a festival in honor of Adonis, who is a different mortal that Aphrodite fell in love with. He was a hunter, and she was worried about him, tried to keep him from going out hunting. Of course, he likes hunting, so he goes off hunting anyways and gets gored by a boar. There was a festival then in sort of honor of him on his death, so his tragic death. Now, Winkler takes a different approach from Foley. Foley took the position that the Homeric Hymn number 2 to Demeter, and the ritual, that's connected to it, were not so much challenges to the status quo, but actually endorsed social conformity, right? That women's right path was to get married and have children, get married to a male, so heterosexual normative, ideas. And she reads the poem that way, or at least says that the feminists who claim that it's an attack on patriarchy, they don't have the evidence, and that you could find just as much evidence that it's in favor of patriarchy. The Winkler piece looks at this festival of Adonia and says that myth or ritual can be a challenge to the status quo. So Winkler's point is that in this festival, one of the features in this festival is a women's only festival. The women would plant some seeds, and these apparently were quick acting seeds. So you'd plant the seeds, and by the next day something was springing up. And it would apparently produce some sort of plant that would stand up tall. Sort of like in our backyard, we get these surprise lilies that just sort of pop up. They're there for like a day or so, and then they're gone. And it's a similar type thing. And so this plant pops up, and then it quickly droops, like within a day or so. So, according to Winkler, women would laugh then, and this was a way that women had of showing that women were powerful because, unlike men, they didn't fade, right? So this male sexual cycle, the guy gets excited, there's sex, he ejaculates, and then it's droopy time, right? So that is not the experience of women, and of course women get pregnant, so they have the child within them for the fetus within them, which becomes a child for 9 months. So there's this living with their sexuality in a way that men sort of don't. And so at any rate, Winkler says this gives women some room to be critical of patriarchy. I agree with him that I think that's probably true, and yet I think ultimately it tends to reinforce patriarchy, because what it does is it provides a safety valve for women to sort of blow off steam, and then they're back to their normal routine, which is within the patriarchal system. So, arguing that myth can and ritual can basically blow apart systems of oppression, really not. Those systems are actually very difficult to dismantle, and no myth or ritual is going to do that. It can give you some distance in some way of resisting, but overthrow, not so much. The reading from the Middle East is The Descent of Inanna. This is a Babylonian myth. Apparently the original was composed sometime between 1800 and 1600 BCE. So again, older than any of the Greek literature we have. Inanna is the Babylonian goddess of sexuality. So she's the equivalent of Aphrodite. And Aphrodite is one of the goddesses for sure that has a lot of the Middle Eastern goddesses in her makeup. Her cult center, remember, is in Cyprus. Cyprus is just off the coast of Lebanon and is just south of modern-day Turkey. And so the Inanna, Ishtar, Astarte, those goddesses who are all sort of Middle Eastern goddesses of sexuality, all have a real strong influence on Aphrodite. At any rate, Inanna in this story travels to the underworld. And I have to say, I've read this selection several times. I don't see anything within the poem that indicates why she goes to the underworld. Her sister is the queen of the underworld, and she seems to want to see her sister, maybe to mock her or show how powerful she is. I don't know, but as she travels down to her sister's kingdom, she comes to a series of gates. At each gate, she has to take off a piece of clothing, and that indicates a gradual loss of power. So that when she goes through the final gate, when she's actually in the underworld, she is totally powerless. She has no way of getting out, and then sexual behavior stops in the world above. So no animals, no humans are having sex. There aren't any kids being born. This long term would be a real problem. And so there needs to be a surrogate, which is not really expressed in the selection that we have, but in most versions it's Dumuzi, who in this poem is the lover of Inanna, who agrees to spend some time with Ereshkigal, Inanna's sister, in the underworld, and that allows Inanna to go back to the world above. So that seems to be what's going on, that in the passage right after the selection we have, Dumuzi volunteers to sort of take Inanna's place. And the final thing is the Nachleben. And the Nachleben here looks at the Pygmalion story in movies. And you have some extra credit options here if you need extra credit points. Now, the Pygmalion story goes as follows. Pygmalion is a sculptor on the island of Cyprus. The women of Cyprus do something to offend Aphrodite. Aphrodite then causes all the women to like totally lose their mind, and they're basically just having crazed sex everywhere in the city. Pygmalion is sort of a prudish guy. He sees all this and he's totally grossed out by it. He goes back and he sculpts a statue of a woman that he considers the perfect woman. All right, so this statue. And then he falls in love with the statue. So there's definitely some kinky stuff going on here. He a year later, he goes to the festival of Aphrodite, in his town, and he prays to Aphrodite to give him a woman like his statue. And then when he goes home, the statue has come to life. He names her Galatea. Maybe he had already named her, but she's now actually a woman. And then they become a couple. They have a child named Paphos, which is the name of one of the cities in Cyprus. So what modern versions are there? Well, My Fair Lady is a version of a play by George Bernard Shaw called Pygmalion that follows Professor Henry Higgins, who transforms a flower girl, a Cockney flower girl, Eliza Doolittle, into a lady. And then Pretty Woman with Julia Roberts and Richard Gere is another sort of variation on that, right? She's a streetwalker. She seems to have she's a streetwalker who has standards, and Richard Gere needs someone to go with him to business meetings, sort of eye candy, but also sort of has to have a certain amount of class. So she gets trained to be a lady. So any of those versions, and there are tons of them right out there. They mention 4 different versions. You can take one of those 4, watch the movie, write a report about that for extra credit points. But there are other movies that I think also do the Pygmalion story, this idea of one person trying to transform another person into whatever their ideal is, and how it sort of backfires often. So any of those. I mean, Weird Science is one. Mannequin is one. I mean, there are a bunch that you could possibly also look at if you know those other films better. So a lot on your plate. So get the work for this week done. I would urge you to try to get that done fairly soon so that you have time to devote to the test. I will give another reminder about the test 2 days out and 1 day out to make sure that you get the test done. But the test, all the tests count. So if you miss the test, that's going to do a number on your score. So you have to do the test. Absolutely. The essay, that's up to you. But if you possibly can find the time, I would recommend that you get it done so that you can free up time later when you may need it. Okay, so that's it for this time. See you next week.